There is a shoebox in my closet that I have not been able to bring myself to put away, and I have been thinking about why that is for the better part of 2 years now. My name is Walter. I'm 82 years old, and inside that box are 43 letters that my mother wrote to me across 30 years of my adult life that she never sent, that I never knew existed, that I found in the back of her bedroom closet 6 weeks after her funeral, and that have, in the 2 years since I found them, dismantled and rebuilt everything I thought I understood about who she was. I want to tell you the whole story, because the whole story is the only honest version. And because I think what happened to me when I read those letters is something that a great many people would recognize if they had access to the interior lives of the parents they thought they knew. And most of us don't get access to those interior lives until it is too late to do anything with the access, except sit with it and try to understand what it changes. My mother's name was Evelyn. She was born in 1921 in a small town in rural Virginia, the daughter of a tobacco farmer and a woman who had been, before her marriage, a school teacher, and who afterward was simply a farmer's wife, which was a reduction that I understand now. Having read the letters, she felt more acutely than she ever expressed. My grandmother, the school teacher who became a farmer's wife, was the first ghost in the story I am trying to tell you, the first of several women who wanted more than their circumstances offered and who made their accommodations with that, wanting in ways that traveled forward into the next generation and the one after that, traveling in the way that unexpressed things travel, not as statements, but as patterns, not as lessons, but as the texture of how love was given and received and withheld and misread. My mother was the second child of 4, the only girl, and she grew up in the specific conditions that the only daughter of a farming family in rural Virginia in the 1920s and 1930s grew up in, which is to say, she grew up understanding from a very early age that the expectations for her future were both clear and limited, that the path from her front door to her eventual life ran through a relatively narrow set of possibilities, and that the intelligence she possessed, which was considerable, and the curiosity she had, which was bottomless, were going to need to find their expression within those possibilities rather than beyond them. She was a reader. That is the thing I knew about her from my earliest memory, the thing that was most consistently true about her across the entirety of her life as I witnessed it, the thing that distinguished her in my child's understanding from the mothers of my friends, most of whom were not readers in the same way, not readers in the sense of someone who needs books the way some people need air, who treats the library as the most important building in any town she lives in, who reads at the kitchen table while the coffee gets cold and does not notice because she is somewhere else entirely. She was that kind of reader, and it was the single quality of hers that I most clearly inherited, and for a long time I understood it as the primary connection between us, the thread that ran between her interior life and mine, and that made us, despite our considerable differences in temperament and expression, recognizably the same kind of person. What the letters taught me was that the reading was not simply a pleasure or a habit. It was the primary way she had access to the interior life that her circumstances did not otherwise provide room for, and that I had understood as a pleasant characteristic of my mother without understanding what it was a response to. My mother married my father in 1943, when she was 22 years old and he was 24, and the marriage happened in the particular compressed urgency of the war years, when young people made permanent decisions on accelerated timelines because the alternative, waiting for more normal conditions, felt like a gamble on whether the conditions would ever return. My father was a decent man. I want to say that clearly, a steady and reliable man who worked hard and provided for his family with consistency, and who loved my mother in the way that I understood love to look when I was growing up, which is to say reliably and practically, and without a great deal of verbal expression of the interior experience of it. He showed up. He was there. He fixed things and paid for things, and was present at the table, and in the house and in the life, and he did not, so far as I could see as a child, Understand that these things, while genuine and necessary, were not the entirety of what my mother needed from the person she had married. I was born in 1942, which means I was conceived before the marriage, which I discovered only in the letters, which is one of the smaller revelations they contain, but one that reconfigured something in my understanding of the timeline of my parents' life and of the conditions under which my mother entered the marriage that defined the next 50 years of her existence. My brother David came in 1945, and my sister Frances in 1948, and by the time my mother was 27 years old, she had 3 children, a house, a husband, and the particular arrangement that those conditions produced in the post-war American suburbs, which was a life that was full in every practical sense, and that had, in its fullness, very little room for the things that she needed most, which were solitude and depth and the specific quality of engagement that she found in books and that she could not, or believed she could not, find elsewhere in the life she was living. I grew up close to my mother in the way that first children sometimes are close to their mothers, close in the sense of being the child she talked to more, confided in more, turned toward in the small daily moments when she needed company that was something more than the maintenance of household routine. I was not aware of this as a distinction when I was inside it. I understood it simply as the way things were, as the natural character of our relationship, without registering that it was a particular relationship that had been formed by particular conditions and that it created, alongside the closeness, a set of expectations and obligations that I carried without fully understanding I was carrying them. My mother talked to me about books from the time I was old enough to talk about books. She brought me to the library the way other mothers brought their children to church, with a seriousness and a consistency that communicated, without stating, that this was where the important things happened, that the books on those shelves were not entertainment, but the primary means by which a person understood the world and their place in it. I absorbed this with the completeness that children absorb things from parents they love and respect, and the absorption shaped everything about who I became, what I studied, what I did for my professional life, what I valued, and what I found it difficult to respect in people who didn't value the same things. I became a professor of literature at a university in North Carolina. I spent 40 years teaching books to young people who were in the process of deciding what books were for, and I brought to that teaching the same quality of seriousness and belief that my mother had brought to our Saturday library trips, and I was good at it in the way that you are good at things that are continuous, with the deepest formation of who you are, rather than things you have learned to perform. The career was, in every important sense, my mother's legacy, the direct product of what she had given me, and I knew that, and said it publicly on the occasions when it was appropriate to say it, and she received the acknowledgment with a pleasure that was visible and brief, and immediately managed into something more modest, which was characteristic of her, and which I understood as her way of receiving praise that she was not quite comfortable holding. What I did not understand, until the letters, was that the pleasure was complicated by something I had not seen, which was grief. Not grief for herself exactly, but the particular kind of grief that arrives when you recognize in another person's life the fulfillment of a possibility that was available to you once, and that you did not pursue, and that you love the person for fulfilling it and feel, alongside the love, the specific weight of the road not taken. My mother had wanted to be a teacher, not a school teacher in the way of her own mother, though she would not have refused that, but a professor, a scholar, a person who spent her life inside the books and ideas that she had spent her life reading around the edges of. She had had the intelligence for it, she had the hunger for it, she had the love for it, and she had not done it. And the letters are the record of what it felt like to watch her son do it instead, to watch him live the version of the life that she had wanted and had not allowed herself to want too loudly. I found the letters on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 2021. My mother had died 6 weeks earlier at the age of 99, which is a number that still strikes me as remarkable. And I was at her house with my daughter, helping to sort through the accumulated material of a century of living. The furniture and the clothing and the books, always the books, which filled 3 shelves in the living room, and 2 in the bedroom, and stacks in various corners that had accreted over decades into a kind of architectural feature of the house, a landscape of reading that was as much a part of the space as the walls. The shoebox was on the highest shelf of her bedroom closet, behind a stack of winter sweaters that I moved without particular attention, and that revealed the box with a casualness that seemed almost wrong in retrospect, the way significant things sometimes arrive without the ceremonial quality that their significance deserves. It was an ordinary shoebox, the kind from a department store, and it had been there long enough that the cardboard had acquired the specific smell of stored things, of time, sealed in a small space. I brought it down and opened it on her bed, and found inside it 43 envelopes, sealed, addressed to me at the various addresses I had lived at across 30 years of my adult life. None of them stamped, none of them sent. I sat on my mother's bed for a long time before I opened the first one. I am not sure exactly what I was doing in that time, whether it was hesitation or preparation, or simply the natural response of a person who understands that what they are about to do is going to change something and who is not quite ready yet for the changing. My daughter came to the doorway and saw my face and understood without asking that something had happened, and she left me alone, which was the right thing and which she knew was the right thing, which is the kind of knowing that I have always found the most valuable in the people I love. The first letter was dated 1978. I was 36 years old in 1978, and I had been teaching for 8 years by then, and I had published my first book the year before, a study of the correspondence of Victorian women writers that I had worked on for 5 years, and that had been received well enough to establish me as a serious scholar in my field, and to produce the particular professional satisfaction of work that has been given the recognition that confirms you have been doing the right thing. My mother had received a copy of the book from me with a note saying that none of it would have been possible without her, which was true and which I had meant sincerely. The letter she wrote in response, the letter she did not send, began with the sentence, "I read your book in 2 days, and I want to tell you things I do not know how to say to your face." I read that sentence, and I understood immediately that what I held in my hands was going to be different from what I had expected, different from the ordinary communication between a son and his mother that I might have imagined when I first saw the box. And I was right that it was going to be different, though I could not have anticipated how, or what the difference was going to cost me to sit with. She wrote, in that first letter, about her own relationship to the women I had written about, the Victorian women who had corresponded with each other and with the men in their literary world with a depth and an intelligence, and a hunger for intellectual engagement that the structure of their lives did not otherwise accommodate. She wrote about what it felt like to read about those women, about their confinement and their longing and their finding of small spaces within the limitations of their circumstances, where the fullness of their minds could have some expression. She wrote about recognizing something. That was the word she used. She wrote that reading about those women felt like reading about herself, and that reading about herself in my book, in the book her son had written and published and received recognition for, felt like a kind of grief she had not expected and did not know what to do with. She did not send the letter. She wrote it, sealed it, addressed it to my faculty address at the university, and put it in the box. And then she went back to her life, and I went back to mine, and the next time we spoke, it was about something ordinary, something practical, some coordination of plans or update on the family, and neither of us said anything about the book except what had already been said, which was nothing like what was in the letter. I read all 43 letters over the course of 3 days. I am not going to try to describe every letter, because the description would not serve the telling, and because some of what is in them is private, in the way that a person's most interior thoughts are private. Private not because they are shameful, but because they were written in the assumption that they would never be read, and that assumption is a kind of sanctity that I want to honor even in the telling. But I want to tell you the shape of what they contained, because the shape is what changed my understanding of my mother. And the changed understanding is what I am here to tell you about. The letters were written across 30 years, from 1978 to 2008, when my mother was in her late 80s, and her handwriting had become effortful in a way that the earlier letters were not. They were written to me at the significant moments of my life, when I published books, when I was promoted, when my marriage ended in 1989, and when I remarried in 1994, when my children were born, when I gave lectures that were written about in the places she read. She followed my career with an attention and a thoroughness that I had known about in the way you know about things that have always been true, as simply the way things were, and the letters showed me the interior of that attention, what it felt like from inside her to watch my life from the outside. She was proud of me. I had known that, and the letters confirmed it with a depth that I had not previously understood. But the pride in the letters was not simple, and the simplicity of the version I had known was itself something I had to reckon with. The pride was layered over something else, something she had not allowed herself to express in the versions of herself she presented to me directly, which was the specific pain of a woman watching someone she loved live the life she had wanted for herself, and of understanding that her love for that person and her grief for herself were not separable in the way she might have wished. She wrote about this with an honesty that stunned me, that I was not prepared for, and that I had to stop and put down several times before I could continue. She wrote about sitting in the library, the same library she had brought me to as a child, and reading reviews of my work in the academic journals she still subscribed to, and what it felt like to sit there, in that building that had been the primary landscape of her intellectual life, reading about the work her son was doing, that she could have done, should have done, had the materials and the capacity to do, and had not done, because the conditions of her life and the shape of the expectations around her, and something in herself that she named in the letters with an honesty that I found almost unbearable, something she called a failure of belief, had prevented it. She believed, she wrote, from an early age, that wanting the kind of life I was living was not something she was permitted to want. Not forbidden, not explicitly denied, but not within the range of serious consideration, not available as a real possibility in the way that it was a real possibility for her son, and that the not permitting came not from any single person or any explicit message, but from the accumulated weight of everything around her, the culture and the expectations, and the particular formation of a girl in rural Virginia in the 1930s who understood, through the 1,000 daily signals of her environment, that the kind of hunger she had was not one that her world had a place for. She wrote about her mother, my grandmother, the former schoolteacher, with a precision and a tenderness that made me understand for the first time what my grandmother had been and what it had cost her, and how that cost had traveled forward into my mother in ways neither of them had ever named. My grandmother had wanted the teaching and had had it taken from her by the marriage, which was not unusual for women of her time, and which she had accepted without visible bitterness, but also without, as my mother understood it from the inside of their family, without complete peace. And the incomplete peace had communicated itself to my mother as a lesson about wanting, as the lived example of what happened to women who built their identity around something the world then required them to give up. My mother had learned from my grandmother's incomplete peace not to want the things she could not keep. She had narrowed her wanting before it could be narrowed for her, which she understood as a form of protection, and which was, as she wrote in one of the later letters with the clarity that sometimes comes in old age, a form of loss so thoroughly accepted that it had stopped feeling like loss and had started feeling like simply the shape of things. I am 82 years old, and I have spent 2 years sitting with what those letters contained, and what I want to tell you about that sitting, about what it has produced in me, is not a simple thing, and I am not going to pretend it is. The first feeling, reading the letters, was grief, the specific grief of learning something important about a person after they are gone, the grief that is compounded by the impossibility of doing anything with what you have learned except carry it. I could not call my mother and tell her I had read the letters. I could not sit across from her and say the things I would have said if I had known while she was alive what I know now that she is not. And the inability to do those things is its own form of loss, added to the loss of her, a secondary grief that sits inside the primary one, like a smaller box inside a larger. But the grief was not the only thing, and I want to say that carefully, because I think the grief is the obvious part, and the less obvious part is what I actually want to offer you. What was also present, as I read the letters, and as I have continued to sit with them across 2 years, was something that I can only describe as a profound expansion of my understanding of my mother as a person, an understanding that was in some ways the most complete and the most honest I have ever had of anyone I have known. I had known my mother for 80 years. I had known her as a child knows a parent, which is with an intimacy and a familiarity that can become, over decades, a kind of blindness, the way you can stop seeing something because you have been looking at it so long. I had known her interests, her habits, her opinions, her values, her way of being in the world, and I had understood all of those things correctly as who she was. And what the letters showed me was that who she was also included things that she had not shown me, things that she had not shown anyone, that she had kept in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet, and had apparently decided, across 30 years of deciding, to keep there. She had a rich and complex and fully inhabited interior life that she had not shared with me, or, as far as I can understand from the letters, with anyone. She had opinions about literature that were more sophisticated than most of my graduate students. She had grief that was specific and clearly examined, and that she had sat with privately for decades. She had regrets that she had analyzed with the precision of someone who had thought about them carefully and honestly, and she had arrived, in the later letters, at something that I would describe as acceptance without pretense, an acknowledgment that things had been as they were, and that the being as they were had cost her certain things and given her others, and that at 87 she was old enough to hold both without requiring either to be different. The letter that undoes me most, that I have read more times than any of the others, is one she wrote in 1994, the year I remarried, the year I was 52 years old, and she was 73. She wrote about watching me at the wedding with the woman I had married, watching us in the specific way that a parent watches a child at a significant moment of their life, with the full and attentive love of someone who is holding the whole of that person in their awareness, all the versions of them across all the years, the child and the young man and the adult, and the person standing now at the front of a room making a promise. And she wrote about what she felt watching that, which was love so large it was uncomfortable to hold, and pride, and the particular tenderness of a parent who understands that the life of their child is its own complete thing, separate from the parent's life, not the parent's to direct or judge or take credit for, simply a life being lived by a person she had loved since before he was capable of loving her back. And then she wrote something that I have turned over hundreds of times in the 2 years since I read it. She wrote that watching me at that wedding, watching me be fully and genuinely in my own life, she had felt, for the first time in a long time, that the things she had not done had perhaps mattered less than she had thought, because the things she had given me, the library and the Saturday mornings, and the books and the quality of attention she had brought to my developing mind, those had produced this person standing at the front of the room, this life being lived with full investment, and that there was a form of continuation in that, a form of expression of what she had been and what she had wanted, that did not require to have been the one standing at the front of any room herself. She wrote that she was not sure this was entirely true. She wrote that she wanted it to be true, and that it was sometimes true, and that on the days when it was not true, the grief was simply present, unchanged by the wanting. And then she wrote that she had decided to try to find the trueness of it more days than not, because she was 73 years old, and because the alternative which was to carry the grief at full weight for whatever years remained, seemed like a poor use of the years remaining. She sealed that letter and addressed it to my home address and did not send it. I have thought a great deal about why she did not send the letters. Not as an accusation, I want to be clear about that, but as a genuine inquiry, as the attempt to understand a choice that was made consistently across 30 years, and that was, I have come to believe, not a failure of courage or a product of conflict about me or about our relationship, but something more specific and more interesting than either of those explanations. I think she did not send the letters because she understood that sending them would change the relationship, would alter the balance of who each of us was in the other's eyes, and that she had made a decision, consciously or not, to preserve the relationship as it was rather than transform it into something else. In the relationship as it was, she was my mother, the woman who had given me the library and the books and the quality of attention, the woman who was proud of me and who received my acknowledgment of her contribution with modest pleasure. In the relationship the letters would have created, she would have been something more complicated, a person with her own unfulfilled desires and her own grief and her own interior life that was not organized around me, but that I had stumbled into the middle of, and she would have been asking me, in the sending of them, to hold that complexity, to be in relationship with the full and complicated person rather than the role. I think she decided 30 years ago that the asking was too much, or perhaps that she did not know how to do it, did not have the language or the practice or the model for what it would look like to be known by her own child in that complete and interior way. The women she had grown up around had not been known that way. Her mother had not been known that way. The tradition she had been formed in was a tradition of interior lives kept interior, of the self presented in its functional and social form, while the rest was kept in a box on the top shelf of the closet. I understand this. That is the thing I want to say that I did not expect to arrive at. I understand it not as a failure or a withholding or a problem to be solved, but as the behavior of a person who was shaped by forces that preceded her, and that she did not fully choose, who made the best accommodations she could to the conditions of her life, and who kept, in that shoebox, the evidence that she was more than the accommodations, that underneath the function and the role and the modest reception of acknowledgment, there was a woman of considerable interior richness who had wanted things and thought things and grieved things and made peace with things in private across 99 years of a life that was, I understand now, more fully lived than I knew. My daughter found me on the third day of reading, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with the letters spread out around me, and she asked me what I had found, and I told her, as much as I could tell her in the form of words that were available to me at that point, which was not very much, but more than nothing. And she listened, and she said something that I have held since, that the letter sounded like a gift, and that the gift was unusual in its form. She acknowledged that, but that a mother giving her son a complete picture of who she was, even posthumously, even accidentally, even in the form of things she had not meant to give, was an act of love, even if it was also an act of withholding, even if it was both of those things at once. I think my daughter is right. I think the letters are a gift, complicated and delayed, and arriving at a cost that includes the grief of not being able to respond to them in the way I would respond if there were still someone to respond to, but a gift nonetheless. They gave me my mother back in a form I had not had her, the complete form, the interior form, the form that does not curate itself for the relationship, but simply is what it is, and receiving that form, even now, even after everything, feels like more than I had before I found the box, which was a great deal, and which was also, it turns out, incomplete. I am 82 years old, and I keep the letters in the shoebox in my own closet now, and I take them out sometimes, the ones I have read the most times, and I read them again, not searching for anything new in them, but simply being in the presence of them, in the presence of her, the full her, the one who wrote things she did not send, and what, I feel when I do that is not only grief, though grief is there, but also a quality of gratitude that has no simple name. Gratitude for the 99 years of her, for the library and the books and the quality of attention, for the complicated pride and the acknowledged grief and the decision to try to find the trueness of things more days than not. Gratitude for the letters she did not send, which have told me more about who she was than anything she said to my face, and which have told me, in the telling, something about who I am and where I come from that I will spend the remaining years of my own life trying to fully understand. She was more than I knew. That is the simplest and the most important thing the letters gave me. And I say it to you now because I think it is probably true of the people you love too. Probably true of the parents you think you know and the people you share your life with, and everyone whose interior is not available to you, except in the edited form they have decided to present, which is almost everyone, which is all of us more than we show and more than we are seen, all of us with things unsent in boxes somewhere, waiting to be found or not found, read or not read, understood or carried to the end, without anyone having had the chance to know what was there. My mother was Evelyn. She was born in 1921, and she died in 2021 at the age of 99, and she spent her life reading and loving her family, and keeping her most interior self in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet. And I found her there, finally, at 82 years old, and she was extraordinary. I wanted you to know that.